Welcome to the Billable Mom Podcast, led by attorney Cari Rincker, where we discuss working motherhood, but especially geared to professional mothers who are trying to juggle their time. Our time is precious, both at work and at home. We talk time management and productivity hacks, the struggles of being a working parent, and provide a community where other billable moms are also trying to calm the chaos 6 minutes at a time. Listen to stories of other working moms, but especially lawyer moms. Navigate the waters balancing career and the ever-present demands of motherhood.
Hi, I'm Cari Rincker, and I'm the Billable Mom, and I am really excited for today's conversation. We have Anne Schmidt in the house, and Anne, you probably don't remember this, but I think I met you first. You were speaking, I believe, at an Illinois State Bar Association or maybe an ICL presentation on retirement accounts and quadros. And at the end of your presentation, you're like, hey, if you have questions or if you want to connect afterwards, let me know. And I literally took your word upon that and I followed up. So, and since then, it's been a pleasure getting to know you both personally and professionally. Why don't you introduce yourselves to our listeners? Tell everybody about where you are, what you do, and sort of your path to become a billable mom.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? So I'm what's called an ERISA attorney by training. So what that is an attorney that specializes in any benefit an employer offers their employees. So the big things that come to mind that we deal with in divorce would be things like 401k accounts, pensions, executive comp, any type of deferred taxation account. It also includes the things that you wouldn't even think about, stuff like employee parking, healthcare, which is obviously a huge component of what employers can sponsor. And the Affordable Care Act is a huge component of ERISA. But I tend to now, at this point in my career, specialize specifically in dividing these assets incident to divorce.
So you have two children who I think are a little older. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit about where you were in your career when you went through your first pregnancy and had your first child.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have sort of a roundabout way of getting to the law. So, 18 years ago now, I left. I had been in an HR capacity in the fashion industry, actually. Working for sort of big box retail and sort of smaller retail. And it's hard to imagine now, but in, 2016, 2015, there was a recession coming and retail wasn't going to have the same numbers it had the year before. And which meant I wasn't going to make my bonuses. And, also I was at a point in my life where I think we were thinking about having children. And I just said, you know what, I'm going to kind of take a break from what I'm doing and figure out what I want to do. And I actually went to law school pregnant with my daughter, who's now 17. So 18 years ago, I went to law school as a second career, which is crazy to think about because I had a whole other career before then. And so I started sort of my whole practice with the baby in my belly. I remember breastfeeding in class, second year in con law, like sneaking in the back and, bringing my baby in. Unfortunately, I went to a law school that was really, really supportive of moms and people. I remember pumping like during exams and, moms wanting to, be in law school. So, I started sort of knowing that I was going to have kids. I then had my second right after law school. And, it was an interesting time because many of my contemporaries who were younger than me, because I was already in my 30s and a lot of people in law school, at where I teach now too, are 25 or so, right? When they start law school at the most. And so we were that 10-year gap was really felt, right? Because when you're applying to jobs, particularly the jobs I was applying to, they can't ask you questions about like when you want to have babies and things like that, but it was obvious that I had kids and that was a concern. And so it definitely sort of changed the trajectory of what kind of law firms were going to want me, right? Because typically in big law, for example, and it's still unfortunately this way, I think, they want you to kind of bust your tush for 6 or 7 years and then have kids, right? That's why a lot of law firms cover freezing your eggs and a lot of female reproductive care. And so I was kind of going into it knowing that maybe those opportunities of progression weren't really the same for me. And I think that was, really important to understand.
If we could back up, and what advice would you give to any of our listeners who are either pregnant or thinking about starting their family during law school or any other kind of professional school?
Yeah, that's a great question. I found it to be a really amazing time now that I saw my friends and colleagues who had kids while they were working at like a big law firm, because as stressful as law school is, right, and as hard work as it is, you really have a lot of free time, right? You really have like a lot of space to create your own schedule. The only boss you have is yourself, really. And so there was a lot of downtime to be with my kids, when they were tiny, and flexibility. So I think it was great. I think the advice I'd give, I guess, is to make sure you go to a law school or intern at a place that they sort of understand your situation and that you have kids, and are more flexible, maybe with what your needs are, like I mentioned before, like breastfeeding or things like that.
It's so interesting because I feel like time is elastic. And I look back at my law school life, and probably for the first 2 years, I barely went to the gym. I was like, I don't even have time. I have to, study every single minute of the day. It wasn't until my 3rd year where I finally decided to relax into it. But it's just interesting how looking back, you're like, yes, you had freedom, you had time, right, to do those things. So,
well, I think the biggest thing in like what you're mentioning in your podcast, right, is this billable paradigm, right? Not having that billable paradigm of having to make a certain billable hour a year at a big law firm, and just to be able to enjoy. I mean, the other thing too, right, is that lawyers, women still, have to take off time to have a baby, right? So if you're at big law and you take off, 3 months, you're obviously behind on partner track or on billable hours for the year or review, right? And I think law firms recognize that, and they're trying to be more cognizant of that, with sort of paternity leave and, other options. But we're still in the situation where we are the only ones who can give birth, right? We physically, unless you're adopting, right, or you're in a same sex, situation, but in a more conventional heterosexual coupling, I'm the one giving birth. So there's a very clear, bright line of progress, in the year.
So talk to me then about that transition for you after law school into your first professional situation. Were you right in a big law right after law school?
No. So I was really lucky in that the school I went to, which was John Marshall, at the time in Chicago, which is now UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, had a really, really great program with employee benefits with ERISA. So it was a master's in employee benefits, and it was led by this woman, Katie Kennedy, who just retired. I think when UIC took over, they decided to get rid of so many LLM programs and, kind of consolidate. But it was a really special program because part of it was that we had these incredible, not just internships, jobs with the Department of Labor and with the IRS and other agencies that are really involved in benefits. And so starting my 2nd year, I started working for the Department of Labor, and it was a paid job. I mean, it paid for law school. And it was nice too, because while it was a job, it wasn't a law firm job, right? Like it didn't have the billable paradigm. I mean, you obviously had to work hard and, make sure that you were, doing a good job, but working for a federal agency is very different. It was also really helpful because working there enabled me to be attractive to big law, because particularly in my line of work, the agencies, if you work for an agency, they think that you have some sort of inside edge for the audits, or sort of knowing what they're looking for. While that's not true, particularly, it is helpful to kind of have contacts on the inside. I mean, even to today, some of my best friends are people I worked with at the Department of Labor, that I can call up and ask a question, or sort of see what kind of the movements are. But so I worked at the Department of Labor after law school, and then I went to big law.
And at that point of your transition to big law, how old was your firstborn?
She would have been 4 at the time.
And your second child wasn't born
yet? 1.
Yet?
Yeah, no, he's 1.
Well, so how is that? I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. My hands are full. I won't even talk to you about the temper tantrums I had to go through this morning with a Cocomelon blanket. But so talk to me about that transition to big law, where we all know, notoriously, there's a huge demand for your time to get in the grind.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be blunt. I don't think it went well, right? Because I am on my own now. I think it went well in that I created amazing contacts, and I met amazing people that I work with still today. And I really enjoyed the different firms that I've worked at. But there was always, and you probably as a mom don't want to hear this with little ones at home, but I have felt that every phase demands a different amount of attention. When they're little, it's a lot of like comforting, right? It's like a lot of being there for comfort, whether that be through food or, snuggles, or sort of reading a book. But it's not the dialogue. It's not the driving. It's not the taking to sports. It's not the, time consuming. Like, I didn't really have as much mom guilt when they were babies as I did towards when they started to be like preteens, to be honest. Because when they were babies, I could come home, read them a book. They're just as happy to see me as they at any point. It was when they started to be a little older that they started to be like, where are you? Why aren't you available? Why can't you take me to, tennis? There was a lot more sort of need for me to be around. And it was at that point, it was pre-COVID, right? So, one of the things too that I struggle with my staff, and I'm sure other working moms who kind of grew up, who are around 50 like me, we grew up in a way where women had to really make themselves known, like really had to work extra hard at law firms to achieve partner status, to make themselves rise to the ranks. And we sort of grew up a little bit of a backlash to that. Like, why are you so mean to me? Kind of like, why are you, like, don't you understand what I'm going through? And they were sort of like, oh, we had to give up everything. So do you, like, get a babysitter. And then COVID happened, and it like shifted everything completely, because all this kind of stuff that, my generation had been begging for, of like remote work and flexibility and all these things, right? They all of a sudden became really like, oh, you can do it. You can work from home sometimes. You can bill from wherever. Like, we don't need all this FaceTime kind of stuff, right? But now there's sort of this pendulum and this swing the other way, where there's this kind of generation of law students that I think are really suffering, and new lawyers who aren't showing up in the office, who aren't getting apprenticeships, who aren't learning from mentors, who really don't understand how much you have to work. It's really, and I say that like in the most loving way, but like, I really struggle to detail what like even just a 40-hour work week looks to staff, right? Like, there's a lot of, I don't want to say like entitlement, because I think, everything is more expensive now and people have to deal with that as well, right? But I think I'm not sure where the sweet spot is. And I think as women, we're always going to suffer more on the sweet spot, right? Because we have to work really hard to prove ourselves. On the other hand, we sort of want to be friendly and available and like home with our kids. And
to be perfectly candid with you, and I've had associate attorneys and contract attorneys work for me, and in the remote context, and I can really tell the difference with attorneys who have worked full time in the office and have had that experience versus attorneys who have just sort of started their career remotely. So it is a difficult sort of balancing act on like what you need sort of professionally and then as a parent and that flexibility there. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I mean, I think it's really, we're kind of doing associates a disservice if we don't make them come in some. Like I'm all for flexibility in the sense that, there are certain days, like if you're just sitting there drafting or something, like why not be wherever, you know what I mean? Like, why do you need to be next to me in an office? But it's really hard to ask questions, bounce time, learn, advance in your career without coming into the office. I just don't think you're going to get the same level of training or candidates without some face time. And part of that is because like I've worked hard enough and gotten to the place in my life, right, where like I'm not the one who needs to be available for you. You need to be available for me, right? Mm-hmm. Like when all of a sudden I'm like, hey, let's review this project or let's go over this or let's go into detail, right? Like I want to step next door and find you.
Right.
It's not really the opposite. And I think that's where people really lose out on the work from home.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Let's take a quick break. Let's hear from our sponsor. And when we return, Anne, I know at some point you transitioned to your own practice. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Great.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bottorff, SVP of Growth at Lawmatics. Here's everything you need to know about Lawmatics. Ready? We are the #1 CRM for law firms of all sizes. We help you win more business, speed up intake, and boost efficiency. We integrate smoothly with your favorite practice management tools like Clio, Smokeball, and Practice Panther. And get this, 95% of Lawmatics users see an increase in revenue while 91% see an increase in efficiency. Check out Lawmatics at lawmatics.com and mention the Billable Mom during your demo to get 10% off your subscription. That's LAWMATICS.com.
So, Anne, at what point then did you transition out of big law into your own law practice?
5 years ago, really exactly. I think it was 5, right? If I did the math right. Really beginning of 2019.
So right before COVID hit, really?
Right before COVID, yeah. Nobody knew it was coming. I had seen in my line of work that there was a real potential, a real market for neutrals, because most of what I draft are orders for the Department of Labor and the IRS, and they don't really have there's not a lot of advocacy in them, and people were spending so much on legal fees to get them done because the law firms were kind of going back and forth on them. And I realized that we could save. I mean, I think my background, right, at the Department of Labor is to save people's retirement, to make sure that they're preserving it, right? And all of a sudden now I'm in a job where I kind of decimate it. And so I wanted to figure out a way to not have as many fees attached to it, and still provide really good service. And so I knew that maybe going off on my own was the only way to do that. Because if you're at a firm, right, the other firm doesn't trust you. And then they have to review it and hire somebody. So I was really trying to make a better product. And so I went off on my own. About 5 years ago now.
And at that point in time, how old were your children?
So my daughter would have been 12 and my son 8.
That's an interesting time period. So how was that transition to your own law practice when they're kind of like preteen, years and things?
I mean, I also, I'm very spoiled, right? In that I chose to make my practice exactly a mile walk from my house. Oh. So, most of the time I just walk to work and or bike to work, particularly when the weather's good. But I did that on purpose, right? Because my husband and I started to notice that they needed more. We have particularly seems, I don't know why, but particularly athletic kids. And, you know, a lot of their practices and things like that after school or travel teams or sports teams or things like that. So one of us needed to be available. So
what
it was
tips
nice to come home.
What tips do you have for the listeners in terms of like work-life balance? I mean, how did you sort of juggle that? Just a business owner to business owner. I mean, I feel like for me, sometimes it's really hard to turn it off. I feel like I need to grab hours, so work hours on the weekends and things. How did you navigate those waters?
I don't think there is such a thing as work-life balance, I guess, particularly if you're running your own practice, right? And you're not just like checking in 9 to 5 at a job. I mean, I don't think you're attracted to law unless you're kind of a fixer, you know, unless you want to make things perfect and like you have a perfectionist sort of personality. And so it would be very hard to just turn things off. I think what I've tried to do, particularly with my kids, is teach them like the value of how hard I work and how, you know, how important it is to have a role model, you know, that is working so hard to provide for them and all of their, you know, their needs, right? Rather than try to be like, okay, now I'm just like the fun mom. I mean, there's just times where they come into the kitchen and, you know, I'm working. I mean, like I can't really always turn that off. So I try to sort of make it more of a good trait, right? Like that, you know, I'm doing this to provide for them, to provide for my own intellectual curiosity and satisfaction. Now that they're older, also they can come to my office and work a bit, you know, doing things. So, but yeah, at the time, I've also been really, I mean, look, I think it's very hard to have two people accelerating in their careers at the same time. I think that's why there's such a, not to get too political, right? But that's why there's such a backlash against like women right now, is that this idea that like, you know, we now take up 56% of people in law school and medical school, right? In professions, right? Like there's this idea that there was like this simple sort of Norman Rockwell time of the 50s and 60s where like kids came home and were happy and dinner was provided for them and, you know, mom was there and, you know, none of it was true, right? Like it's just not true. You know, I can't tell you how many divorces, I'm sure you do as well, right? Of stay-at-home moms, right? Of this idea of this like, sort of like, I want a life that's more interesting, that's more curated. And that's not to demean at all that being a parent is a fantastic job, right? But it's just as a fantastic job for your husband, you know, and they're stepping up and being a team player in that. I've always really been lucky that I have an equal partner in that. And so I guess what I would encourage for work-life balance is to create better partnerships, you know, whether it's through marriage, through friends, through, you know, colleagues, because you can't really do it all your own. Like I can't, particularly if you have more than one kid, right? Like I can't be at both games, right? I can't drive them to both practices. I can't, even if I was a stay-at-home mom, right? Like how am I going to do all that? So creating a network and sort of, and creating better partners, I think creates more of a, if there is such a thing as a work-life balance.
So, Anne, I know that we both sort of manage sort of small teams, right? We're not by ourselves. And sometimes I feel like I am succeeding in this regard, and other days I feel like I'm a failure. But I'm trying to get more bandwidth for my personal life with trying to be a better delegator of work at the office. And I don't know, do you want to talk to me a little bit about sort of your successes or struggles in that regard in sort of hiring and delegating to give you more bandwidth so you can be more present?
Yeah, that's a real struggle. I mean, I think, you know, look, I part of it, right, is generationally, you have a younger population, if you're hiring younger people, right, that didn't grow up in the same kind of culture of work. And so, you know, kind of, like I said before, kind of understanding like work requirements, work parameters, professionalism, I have found has been a little bit of a challenge, I'm gonna be honest. The other issue, I think, is pay. I think there's an expectation of salary that is really high. And, I don't know how that is downstate versus, kind of in the Chicagoland area, but I don't begrudge them for that at all. Like, first of all, I think you should always advocate for more money in any position, right? Like you should always be somebody who wants to be successful. But look, rent is like really expensive in Chicago. There's things that like just make people feel like they need to make more money. The other thing I think is like media sort of maybe their contemporaries who were like sort of the creme de la creme of their classes are getting very high salaries, either at big law, straight out of school. I mean, the difference of like a family law lawyer associate coming out of law school, I mean, the range could be anywhere from like $60,000 to $90,000, right? Whereas like the range at big law is going to be somewhere between like $160,000 and $200,000 or $220,000, right? I mean, the difference is so extreme. And I think the problem is that they go to law school and they think that like, oh, I should make $200,000 a year. And it's just like,
Right.
It's not going to happen. So, I mean, depending on if you want to go into corporate or, depending on what you want to do. Right. So I think that's part of it. I think from a staffing perspective, because I have a lot of support staff, I would say that the like for me, we do use a lot of technology. So like it's really the technology which allows me to have some work-life balance more so than anything else, because I can't really function without a computer or phone at the time.
So talk me a little bit about that. What kinds of technology have you found to be the most helpful to you? Like, for example, just in the last 6 months, although it's been a little painful, have moved to a task management program called Asana, and that has, in a sense, sort of, to your point, kind of given some lift in my brain, knowing that in theory, all the tasks are sort of organized and documented there, and we're clear on who's doing what, but it has not come without struggles. So I don't know, what have been some useful tools for you?
Yeah, I would say the same story. I mean, we use something like Asana. It's called Monday.com. That's been pretty life-changing for me. I wish I could use it for everything. Yeah. I think the problem is that small, like big law, right? Like lawyers conventionally are pyramid schemes, right? So you got the partners on the top and then the associates and everyone's billing, and they're just using a pretty straightforward software, right? They're just using a billing software. That's all anyone cares about, right? Is billing. And then if something's falling through the cracks, you're screaming at your associate, right? Like it's their job to keep it organized and to keep the case file on time and statute of limitations if that's an issue or whatever, right? Or the paralegals, everyone sort of has their methodology for keeping track of their individual cases. And the problem is that law firms aren't really run like businesses, right? So it's not like a project team management sort of purview. And I think the problem is when you're running your own small shop like we are, or smaller firm, you have to run it like a business. And so now all of a sudden you're waking up in the middle of the night being like, oh my God, did this fall through the cracks? Did they do this? Did they do that? Because ultimately your name's at the top of the sign, right? And if it does, it's going to fall to you. So this kind of urgency for more software that really helps with those goals. So yeah, I mean, I have found Monday to be really, really helpful in that.
It's funny that we're talking about this. My firm has core values. One of our core values is accountability and ownership over responsibilities. And, I think it's a hard thing sometimes for people to really feel accountable for things, right? At the end of the day, and one of the conversations I had with my staff this week is just making sure it gets across the finish line, right? Like not 80% done, but like 100% done. And I don't know, what do you think your advice would be from a standpoint of management of other people, just trying to instill that accountability and ownership over things so they don't fall back on you?
Yeah, that's hard. I don't know. I mean, I think, I struggle with the same thing. I think sort of creating an environment where you're not in trouble if it falls through the cracks, right? Like creating an environment where you can be kind of open and honest, and then creating a system. I don't know, like last year we had a staff where people were really defensive, right? Like if something did, like, let's use an example. Like, let's say something wasn't entered into court or something, and I tagged that person on Monday and said, at so-and-so, this was not entered into court. Like, what's up? They would take that very personally as sort of like an attack on their work, versus just being like, oh, thanks so much for the reminder. Right. Like,
Right.
And I think part of what I've done is having people double check me as well, so that we're all kind of on the same, everyone can sort of tag somebody else and be like, hey, I noticed this. Where is this status? Like, what's happening?
Right.
So that I can be like, oh, darn, like I dropped that ball on that. You know what I mean? Like, thank you so much for reminding me. Because we're all human. Obviously we make mistakes. We're trying to multitask to a fault. Right. I think that's definitely like a difference between, like, I can even see with like my husband, right? Like, sometimes I'm frustrated with him because he can't multitask, right? Like he does the job, he does it so well, he finishes it to completion, and then he moves on to the next thing when he's done. And that makes me feel like sometimes he's inefficient, like he's slow. Whereas like I'm juggling, 7 different things in the air. But when you do that, you can multitask to your own detriment. And if you don't create like guardrails or systems to catch that, I mean, you are going to be sort of in trouble. So I think creating a team environment, hopefully, where people don't feel accused, they feel more sort of understood, is helpful.
Yeah. And I'll quickly get back to the technology question here in a second, but I have an acupuncturist in New York City, and she is a recovering lawyer. And she had said something really, really profound, that the law is basically set up to help you fix mistakes. Right. So like there's really very few mistakes that are like not correctable, like missing an appeal deadline, missing a statute of limitations deadline. These are mistakes that are not correctable. But for the most part, like F-ups can get fixed. So, but I can't fix an F-up if I don't know about it. Right. So I think trying to have that attitude in a law practice is good, to have the openness there. What have been some other useful technology tools that you've utilized?
Well, we use a lot of like template builders because we're drafting orders that are similar, so like kind of creating our own templates so that they can be generated, more quickly. I think the biggest thing for us is trying to eliminate human error, which is really hard, right? Like typing something in and switching 2 numbers, or, typing something in and, grabbing a different number, things like that. I think there's probably going to be a huge movement towards AI on that. I don't really know how that's going to work. I'm not sophisticated enough in AI, but I think from a technology perspective, that is the area where if I had more time, I have a personal interest in making more efficiencies, because we spend a massive amount of money on software a year for a firm my size. I mean, I think my software bill is like $40,000 because we use, Clio, we use Clio Grow, we use Clio Draft, we obviously use 365, like a SharePoint, we use Monday, then you have to have all your cyber protection software, right? So I think that's a place of efficiency for expenses too, that I would like to see as like a small business owner made better, but it's really hard to focus on that and to like find the time.
So, Anne, let's take another quick break here from our sponsor. And when we return, I'd love to maybe talk about how, in the midst of all this, managing a law practice with children, what about your own health and wellness? How are you managing that on top of everything else?
Yeah, that sounds great.
This episode of the Billable Mom Podcast is brought to you by Rincker Law PLLC, focusing in food, farm, and family. When I'm not a mother juggling 2 littles, I'm the principal attorney of Rincker Law, where we believe that strong communities have both strong families and a food, fiber, and agriculture system. At Rincker Law, not only do we do family and matrimonial law, but we also work with entrepreneurs and agriculture producers on business, estate, and succession planning. We are a client-focused, results-driven law practice. At Rincker Law, we also support other billable moms, not only here in the workplace at Rincker Law, but also with clients, helping them live their dreams both in business and at home. For more information, visit us at www.rincker.com. rinkerlaw.com. Cari Rincker, Rincker Law, Food, Farm, and Family.
So, and candidly, one of the things that I've really struggled with, during my pregnancies and postpartum, is my own health and wellness, right? I feel like I'm just now kind of getting into the groove. I'm going to like this 5:15 in the morning workout class now a couple days a week and going to see a personal trainer. But it has been a real struggle for me. And I'm curious, among all the things, like how have you sort of managed your own health and wellness?
Yeah, no, that's hard. I do. So I have this thing in my office. It's called a mirror. It's like a Lululemon mirror. So a lot of times during the day, I just get up and do like 10 minutes of stretching, like a class or, some yoga, just like stretch out my back. I have a little trampoline in my office too. So I feel like that's good for your lymphatic system. I just bounce when I'm stressed out and just put a little trampoline down and just jump. I also, I definitely, it was harder. I mean, you're in the thick of it, right? It's really hard. Cause like I said, you're at the point of childcare where your kids just need like you to hold them, right? Like you have to be present. For me, it's a lot more like texting now, like, oh, I didn't get like a good grade on my math test. And, like, where are you, my one who can't drive? Like, are you going to take me to my friend's house? Like, it's not as much like actual physical presence. So I have the time now to go to a workout class or, pay more attention to that. I think the food is the hardest part, honestly, because, particularly if you have two working parents and then you're always like, oh, what's for dinner? I think that's really hard to organize. One thing I've been better about is just giving myself some slack on the fanciness of the food, right? Like, I'll go to Costco and just buy like, I don't know if you know, there's like Kevin's meals or, different like sous vide type things. You just warm them up and make some rice and like, hey, that's dinner. Like kids, if you wanted something more exciting, like, sorry, that's it. Like, you get a protein and a carb and like, hopefully you eat some fruit somewhere. I think just not holding ourselves to sort of this like trad wife, like, perfection objective, right? That like every night should be like a brisket, for our kids. I think there's so much pressure on that and so much social media presence of like what we should not only physically look like, but what our home should physically look like and what our life should physically look like. Right. And it's just too much. It's just too much for women.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head because I feel like women, there's a lot about motherhood, especially working motherhood, that can feel very personal. Like, I'm supposed to be this magnificent mother and then also this incredible attorney and manage my law practice with perfection. And I'm supposed to have a clean house and, and my children need to eat healthy and not too much sugar. And it's just, there's a lot of judgment about all these different aspects of your life. And you literally can't like do everything well at the same time all the time. And so I think,
and I guess I question who is creating that judgment? Is it really other women? Like, I mean, that's what bothers me about it, right? It's like, why does and like, I mean, I don't know your marriage relationship, but like my partner, fortunately, is like, so cool. But like, at the same time, like, I remember people or friends of mine, they'll be like, oh, I've got to babysit my kids tonight. And like, no mother would ever say that. Like only mother would say that, right? Like, or, oh, I've got to like cook dinner tonight or, something like that. Like this idea, this like gender assignment is what leads to this undue pressure, right? That somehow you're not in this equal partnership, right? And so I think to make sure that, and it's okay to like outsource things too, right? I think that there's this idea that like, okay, I'm going to spend my entire weekend scrubbing my house down. Well, no, I can hire a cleaning lady if that's something that I need, right? Like, or, like I said, I can't make like a perfect meal every night, but I do think that a lot of this stuff that's going into the media and a lot of the stuff that's going into Instagram and Facebook and all this stuff is created by like white cis men, right? It's created by men who have this like idea of what a woman should be like and what she should look like and how she should behave and how the kids should look. And And we are falling prey to that. And it's very uncomfortable to me. Like, I don't think that that is anything at all of what life is supposed to be like. And I worry about that. Like, I have a teenage daughter, and this idea of like what your body should look like and what takes for you to be success. And, you can't be like too thin, you can't be too fat, you can't have too short hair, have too long hair. Right. Like, everything, have perfect grades, but don't seem too smart. Right. Like, everything is just sort of this idea. And I think it's our job to sort of say no, like just, push back on it a little bit. And
yeah, I love that. I feel like it's a constant balance between like giving myself grace and then also putting too much pressure on myself and trying to figure that all out. There's a book that I read recently called The Stress Cycle, and it talked about women who work and have kids. It's like they have a first shift at work, right? Second shift at home. And then sometimes, if for me, especially with small children, it's like a third shift, which is like the person who's covering the sleep. If they're waking up in the middle of the night, I mean, at a certain point, you feel like you're on call 24 hours a day, right? And like, when do you get to rest, yourself and recharge? So,
well, that's why work is so important. I mean, look, I think, I have a lot of women who have left the workforce, right? Because, their partner says to them, look, I'll give you an example. You're just a school teacher. You make $60,000 a year. Our childcare is going to cost more than that. And so you stay home with the kids, and I'll work. And isn't this a great life for you as like a stay-at-home mom? And these people are inherently unhappy. Like, they just are, because they left a career that was interesting to them. They left all the retirement on the table. They left all the progress. They left everything that they can't go back to, right? To be at home. And there's a pressure there that when their husband walks to the door, that they better look the right way. They better have the house clean. They better have a perfect dinner. Their kids better be cleaned and behaving. And the husband comes home and is sort of like, well, I expected all those things too, because I'm busting my tush at work and you get to just be at home. And so there's this inequity of, I would say most divorces that I work on are dealing with some sort of inequity, right? And some sort of fatigue, right? Like that wife doesn't want to have sex at night, right? Because she's exhausted from her day of just only child caring and not getting to talk to grownups and having sort of her own intellectual bandwidth. I mean, work is so much more than money. And I think that that's what we've really lost sight of. Like, you don't work just to cover expenses. You work because you have an intellectual curiosity of being with other humans to create a vocation for yourself, right? And when we make it just about, I mean, look, that's the very first world thing to say, right? Many people have to work just to cover bills. But when we put ourselves in sort of this socioeconomic bracket where one person can just be at home, and then we're sort of dealing with an inequity that is hard to overcome. And then also you've got the issue of, once those kids are sort of teenagers and able to be self-supporting, what's your job now, right? Like, how do you go back into the workforce? Like, I can't tell you how many overeducated stay-at-home moms there are that cannot get a job when they want to go back into the workforce. Like, I always give advice of like, keep a toe in, right? Like, just somehow keep a toe in, right? Like, I mean, I had a case, I'm sure everyone's had this case where, husband is saying, hey, oh, she's a lawyer, she could go back and make $200,000 a year. And you're like, she's going back as a first year. Like, what are you thinking? Like, she's 50 years old. She hasn't worked in a law firm in 20 years. Like, no law firm is hiring her. No law firm. She doesn't understand the technology now. She hasn't worked in a law firm in many years. Like, she's going to have to build herself back up. So I guess my advice is always, keep your toe in, and like, give yourself some grace. And I do think being a stay-at-home mom is a really hard job. I mean, that's why I don't do it. I don't think it's an easy job.
I feel like, and I know that says on previous episodes, but it's like, I feel like sometimes I go to work for a break, right? And I have a friend and colleague in New Jersey who's a prosecutor, and when you're working for the government, you don't get paid great. And she basically admitted to me that her entire paycheck goes to pay for childcare. And she's okay with that because she wants to have her career, right? And, on the other side, when her children are older, she's now thinking about judgeships and things along those lines. But, it was not an economic decision for her. She wanted to be able to have that work for her own self. So I don't know. These are hard decisions, I think, for women to make.
Yeah, I don't know why men. I don't know why we're not more comfortable with men making those decisions. I mean, I guess that's the question, right? It's like this idea of motherhood. Why can't it just be like parenthood, right? And I think it gets back to the idea that like we're physically the ones who can bear the children, right? And so there's this kind of pressure, or this idealized sort of, religious, like Virgin Mary sort of like idea of women and, what they create and how they should be. But, we were doing such a good job of moving away from that. And I hope that we can continue to push on that. And like I said, I have being a stay-at-home mom is a really, really noble and challenging profession. But I question happiness. And I think that you have to really work hard to create other outlets for yourself as a stay-at-home. To make, because, my whole like interest, like you were saying about books and stuff and reading, my whole interest is marriage, right? My whole interest is like, how do you create healthy, happy marriages? And there statistically is a harder time in sort of the happiness quotient, I think, for people that don't have outside interests of the home.
Yeah, I think that's right. So, Anne, I know we're running a little short on time. I'm curious. I know we talked about software before, but are there any other books, products, or anything else that has really helped you along the way that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
For work, I wish there were more. I mean, I'm going to be honest, like, Cari, we should write a book on like how to start your own small firm. I mean, I'm sure, every year I'm like, oh, how do I file this LLC license again? Or like, how do I, is this an expense? Can I write that? You know what I mean? Like, I think there's a lot of just like, having to figure it out all the time that we do. So I wish there were sort of more like, guidebooks on that. I think for reading, I tend to read more for, like I said, I have kind of an intellectual curiosity and sort of like marriage and like Brene Brown type books and, how to create. I know a book that I'm obsessed with is The Emotional Life of Teenagers.
Oh, cool.
So I don't know why I can't remember her name right now, but she has a podcast as well. And I think really understanding like how, Instagram and social networking and things, how raising teenagers and how to kind of create like healthy teenagers and how to look for the signs of sort of unhealthy teenagers and, what they're going through. And it's so different than when we were growing up, right?
Yeah.
Just the pressures and the access to the internet and Snapchat and like all these things. And really it's just sort of and I know we have to go, but like one thing I was kind of saying to my daughter the other day, because she was just like, oh, I can't concentrate. I'm studying so hard. I'm not, getting this done. And I was like, are you really? Because you got a phone next to you the entire time. And like, every few seconds that Snapchat is going off. So like, you might think you're studying for 2 hours, but you're really only putting in like 30 minutes of focused time, if that. And so like, how do you kind of get rid of the distractions and sort of this like ADHD sort of culture? Because I'm a victim of it as well, right? Like I'm always looking at my phone. I'm always sort of like distracted. And I mean, I always tell my kids, like, I would have failed college and like graduate school and like my master's and stuff if I had had access to Instagram. Like I never would have been able to stay focused. So I'm interested in a lot of stuff like that, like how to sort of, become more focused. But I wish like, if you have any advice, I would love more like how to become a better boss girl books. Like those would be good books.
So Anne, thank you so much for coming to today's podcast. I'm curious, where can our listeners find you? What's your contact information or any kind of website presence?
Sure. Yeah. So it's just Anne with an E, schmidtlaw.com. So AnneSchmidtLaw.com. Anytime, feel free, or it's just Anne@AnneSchmidtLaw.com is my email. Feel free to send me an email or call up.
All right. Thanks again for coming.
Cari, thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Billable Mom. At The Billable Mom, we don't pretend to have the answers, but instead have all the questions. Please find us on social media and join the conversation at The Billable Mom on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, Pinterest, and YouTube. We also have a Facebook group where like-minded Billable Moms find solidarity and provide a resource to one another. You can learn more about the Billable Mom and our picks for juggling work and motherhood at www.thebillablemom.com. You can also connect with Cari Rincker directly on social media at Cari Rincker. Until next time, let's calm the chaos 6 minutes at a time.